There is a species of analytical failure that afflicts even the most sophisticated observers of geopolitics, and it consists of this: mistaking the map for the territory, the headline for the event, and the obvious interpretation for the correct one. It is an occupational hazard of the 24-hour news cycle, which rewards speed over depth and certainty over nuance, and it produces a particular kind of intellectual blindness, the blindness of a man so focused on the hand that he misses the card being palmed. On April 7, 2026, that blindness was on full, unguarded display across virtually every major Western newsroom, and the story that was missed may prove to be one of the most consequential of this extraordinary year. Here is what the headlines told you. China and Russia vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The resolution had been proposed by Bahrain, revised 3 times over several days to accommodate objections, stripped of any reference to military force, stripped of any Security Council authorization language, limited strictly to defensive coordination within the strait itself, and China and Russia still said no. 11 countries voted yes. Pakistan and Colombia abstained. China and Russia killed it. The U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz condemned them in language that was appropriately forceful. No one should tolerate a regime holding the global economy at gunpoint, he said, but today Russia and China did tolerate it. They sided with a regime that seeks to intimidate the Gulf into submission. The UK said China had chosen to shield Iran. France deplored the vetoes, while carefully noting it had sought only purely defensive measures to provide security without escalation. And that became the story. China sided with Iran. China protected a rogue regime. China made a terrible mistake. But here is the question, the simple, uncomfortable, analytically inescapable question that virtually no Western headline asked. If China is being devastated by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and it is, then why would China vote against its own rescue? China imports more than 10 million barrels of oil every single day, making it the world's largest oil importer by a substantial margin. Before this war began on February 28th of this year, roughly 3.4 million of those daily barrels flowed directly through the Strait of Hormuz from Gulf producers. The strait has been effectively closed since the first American and Israeli aircraft struck Iranian targets and killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. China has had to ban fuel exports, ration domestic supplies, and draw on strategic reserves to manage the disruption. The economic pain is real, measurable, and significant. So why, then, did the country absorbing that pain vote to continue absorbing it? The answer requires us to step back from the immediate transaction and look at the structure of the board. Not just the move being made, but what the board looks like after the move is made. Consider what that resolution, even in its most watered-down form, would have accomplished if it had passed. It would have provided the United States and its allies with international legal legitimacy to project military power into and around the Strait of Hormuz under the imprimatur of the United Nations. The Security Council would have said, in effect, that America has the right, indeed the international mandate, to control that waterway. And if America successfully reopens the strait by force, if Iran backs down under the pressure of American military supremacy operating with full UN backing, then what has been demonstrated? That America still controls the world's most critical energy corridor. That the American security umbrella, which has defined the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East since 1974, remains intact and operative. That any nation on Earth, including China, must ultimately depend on American goodwill for access to the energy that sustains its economy. Chinese strategists have a name for this vulnerability. They call it the Malacca Dilemma. The fear, rooted in decades of strategic planning, that the United States can strangle China's economy by controlling the sea lanes through which Chinese energy imports must pass. The Strait of Hormuz is the Malacca Dilemma writ in crude oil, and it is one of the central anxieties animating Beijing's long-term strategic posture. If America controls Hormuz with UN blessing, America retains the capacity to decide, at a moment of its own choosing, who gets energy and who does not. China's veto of that resolution was not a mistake. It was the prevention of an outcome that would have restored precisely the strategic vulnerability Beijing has spent 30 years trying to eliminate. This is not speculation. This is the explicit logic that China's Ambassador Fu Kong articulated in the Security Council chamber when he explained his vote. The draft, he said, failed to capture the root causes and the full picture of the conflict in a comprehensive and balanced manner. What he meant, translated from diplomatic language into plain English, was this: You attacked Iran. Iran is fighting back, and we will not give you a legal stamp of approval for military operations against the country that is resisting you. Russia's ambassador Vasily Nebenzia was even more direct. The resolution presented Iranian actions as the sole source of regional tensions, he said, while illegal attacks by the United States and Israel went not mentioned at all. And Iran's own ambassador said the draft sought to punish the victim for defending its sovereignty and vital national interests. These are not statements of support for Iranian aggression. They are statements about the framing of the conflict, about who gets to be the aggressor and who gets to be the defender, and what international legitimacy attaches to each designation. Here is where it becomes genuinely important to sit with an uncomfortable fact, rather than rushing past it to the comfort of a simpler narrative. The United States and Israel launched military strikes on Iran on February 28th. They struck nuclear facilities. They killed the supreme leader. And then, weeks later, America went to the United Nations and asked for authorization to use force against the country it had attacked, because that country was fighting back. Now set aside entirely your view of whether the original strikes were justified. Set aside the nuclear question, the terrorism question, the regional security question. Look only at the logical structure of the request. We attacked you, you are defending yourself. Please authorize us to use force against your defense. That is the proposition that 11 nations voted for and 2 vetoed. And from the perspective of most of the global South, most of Asia, most of Africa, most of Latin America, regions that have been on the receiving end of American power projection for decades, China's veto read not as support for Iran, but as a refusal to rubber stamp a predetermined conclusion dressed in the language of international law. That matters. It matters enormously. Because the story of this veto is not just about Hormuz. It is about who gets to define the rules, who gets to invoke them, and who the rest of the world believes is actually following them. And if you want to understand why that matters to your financial future, to the value of the dollars in your savings account, to the cost of every import you buy, to the structural architecture of the global economy, you need to stay with me, because we are only at the beginning of this analysis. And before we go further, if this kind of structural thinking is what you have been looking for, the kind of analysis that goes beneath the headline to the mechanism underneath, then subscribe right now. Because the conversation we are about to have in the next 20 minutes is the one that will give you a framework for understanding not just this crisis, but the next 10 years of global economic history. Subscribe, and do not go anywhere. Let us now examine the second layer of China's calculation, because the veto was not merely a defensive move. It was simultaneously offensive, an acceleration of a structural shift in global finance that China has been patiently engineering for decades, and which the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has now compressed from a generational timeline into a matter of months. To understand why, we need to go back to 1974, to a secret agreement that would quietly govern the global economy for the next half-century. In that year, with the Bretton Woods system of gold-backed currencies already collapsed, President Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger traveled to Saudi Arabia and struck a deal whose full details the world would not know for 50 years. The arrangement was elegantly simple. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars and invest its surplus revenues in American Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States would guarantee Saudi security, stationing troops, providing weapons, and ensuring free navigation for Saudi oil exports. Because every country on earth that needed oil needed to acquire dollars first, this arrangement created permanent, structural, global demand for American currency. It is what allowed the United States to run massive deficits, finance its military empire, and borrow at artificially low interest rates decade after decade. Without the petrodollar, in the bluntest terms possible, America cannot afford to be America. Now observe what happens when the Strait of Hormuz closes. Gulf states cannot export oil. Petrodollars stop flowing. The entire financial architecture that underwrites American power begins, for the first time in 50 years, to crack. Not from a deliberate assault, but from structural failure, from the simple fact that the waterway through which the system flows is blocked. And in the gap, something new is emerging. Iran has been charging passage tolls for vessels attempting transit. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence, at least 2 vessels have paid those fees in Chinese yuan. Deutsche Bank published an assessment stating explicitly that the current conflict may mark the beginning of the end of petrodollar supremacy and the start of what analysts are calling a petro-yuan system. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has already fallen to roughly 57%, a 25-year low, down from 71% in 1999, according to EBC Financial Group analyst Michael Harris. In March 2026 alone, China's cross-border payment system, known as CIPS, handled over $55 billion in trade. BNP Paribas has estimated that if between $600 billion and $1 trillion of oil trade shifts to yuan settlement, the yuan's share of global payments could surpass the Japanese yen and become the fourth most widely used global currency. China has slashed its U.S. Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to just $682 billion by late 2025, while simultaneously expanding yuan-based trade infrastructure across Asia. Every week this crisis continues, the world is pushed, not by ideology but by necessity, toward alternatives to the dollar. And the alternatives that exist, yuan-based oil trade, CIPS, Belt and Road payment networks, Russian, Iranian, Chinese energy corridors, they all benefit Beijing. The U.S. national debt crossed $39 trillion on March 18th of this year, just weeks into the war. Interest costs on that debt are already the fastest growing line item in the federal budget. The United States has now been downgraded by all three major credit rating agencies, S&P in 2011, Fitch in 2023, and Moody's in May 2025. The government is spending $88 billion a month in interest on the national debt, an amount equal to combined spending on defense and education. This is the fiscal context in which America is fighting a war that has sent Brent crude oil to over $102 per barrel today, with a 52-week range stretching from $58.50 to a peak of $119.50. WTI sits near 97. American consumers are paying $4.125 per gallon at the pump, according to the AAA, up sharply from $3.63 a month ago, representing the fastest monthly increase since the 2022 energy shock. Now here is the question that should genuinely keep American strategists awake at night. Who runs out of time first? Consider the asymmetry of preparation. A congressional committee report revealed that China built a strategic petroleum reserve of approximately 1.2 billion barrels by early 2026, roughly 109 days of seaborne import cover, purchased at well below market cost from sanctioned Iranian, Russian, and Venezuelan crude. China's commercial inventories, which soared to 1.47 billion barrels at the end of 2025, according to Energy Intelligence, provide additional buffer. China has been importing crude at an average of roughly 12 million barrels per day, running domestic production of approximately 3.3 million barrels daily, and building overland energy routes through Central Asia, as well as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor for port access that bypasses the strait entirely. China has been accelerating its renewable capacity, solar, wind, nuclear, understanding that the country best equipped to transition away from imported oil will hold the strategic high ground in any sustained energy confrontation. China took the short-term hit, but it is the country that specifically designed its energy posture to absorb exactly this kind of blow. Compare that to America's position. Brent is at $102 and climbing. Gas is above $4 nationally. Inflation spiked to 3.3% in March. Airlines are cutting flights and raising fares. The political pressure is mounting with the speed of a tide. According to the latest available polling, only 34% of Americans support this war. A CBS News survey found that most Americans believe the war's objectives have not been met and that the president does not have a clear plan. A Pew Research survey found that 7 in 10 Americans cite rising gas prices as their top concern from this conflict. The dominant emotions Americans report feeling, across survey after survey, are worry, stress, and anger. And Iran? Iran has been exporting an average of 1.85 million barrels of crude per day through March, more than before the war, mostly to China, through shadow tanker networks that sanctions have failed to interdict. Iran has been preparing for exactly this confrontation for decades. It has built its economic architecture around the assumption of sanctions, around the assumption of external pressure, around the assumption that it must find ways to survive and project power without the permission of the international system it regards as hostile to its interests. Time, in geopolitics, is not neutral. It flows differently depending on which side of a confrontation you are on. China has reserves, alternative infrastructure, and the structural patience of a civilization that thinks in centuries rather than election cycles. America has the world's most powerful military and an electorate that is already asking whether this is worth it. The question of who runs out of time first is not rhetorical. It is the central strategic question of this conflict. And right now, the answer is not obvious in the way that American military supremacy might suggest it should be. We arrive now at the dimension of this veto that is perhaps the most consequential and the least examined. Not the tactical or the financial, but the narrative. Because in the 21st century, in a world connected by instantaneous communication and fractured by competing information ecosystems, the story that a nation tells about itself and its adversaries is not merely propaganda. It is a form of strategic power, one that shapes alliances, determines which coalitions form, and ultimately determines which version of international order the majority of the world is willing to sustain. Let us be precise about what China's ambassador said in that Security Council chamber. He said the draft resolution failed to capture the root causes and the full picture of the conflict. What he was articulating, in the careful language of diplomacy, was a counter-narrative, a version of events that places the United States and Israel as the initiators of violence, and Iran as the party responding to aggression. Now, this is a deeply contested interpretation, one that reasonable people can and do dispute with considerable force. The case for the American and Israeli actions on February 28th rests on decades of documented Iranian support for proxy militias, on the advancing state of Iran's nuclear program, on the existential threat that a nuclear-armed Iran poses to regional stability. These are serious arguments made by serious people. But here is what the counter-narrative accomplished, regardless of its accuracy. It positioned China as the defender of a principle, the principle that you cannot launch an attack on a sovereign nation and then seek international authorization to punish that nation for defending itself, that resonates deeply with the majority of the world's population. Most of the world is not Western. Most of the world does not have a generational memory of the Cold War alliance system that makes American leadership feel natural and legitimate. Most of the world has, at some point in its modern history, been on the receiving end of external power projection by stronger states. When China stood in that chamber and said, in effect, "We will not give America legal cover for this," it was not speaking only to Iran. It was speaking to every government in the global South, in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, that has ever felt the pressure of American sanctions, American military posture, or American-defined international norms. Iran's own ambassador praised the Chinese and Russian moves, saying their action prevented the Security Council from being misused to legitimize aggression. From Beijing's perspective, that framing, being the country that prevents the misuse of international institutions, is extraordinarily valuable. It positions China as the guardian of the rules-based order at precisely the moment when the United States is being characterized, by much of the world, as the country that breaks those rules and then asks for legal cover afterward. Now zoom out from the immediate crisis and observe what the veto accomplished across 4 distinct dimensions simultaneously. In the military dimension, China did not fire a single bullet or spend a single dollar on weapons. It denied America international legal cover for its military operations, weakening Washington's position without China incurring any military risk whatsoever. In the economic dimension, the veto keeps pressure on the petrodollar system, keeps oil prices at levels that stress American finances. Brent at $102, U.S. gas at $4.125 a gallon, and accelerates de-dollarization, while China's reserves and alternative infrastructure allow it to absorb the pain more effectively than its rivals. In the political dimension, the veto positioned China as a champion of sovereignty and international law in a world where most countries are not members of the Western alliance and have deep reservations about the unchecked exercise of American power. And in the narrative dimension, China is telling a story that resonates with the majority of the planet. We are not the ones bombing sovereign nations. We are the ones defending the principle that you cannot attack a country and then punish it for fighting back. 4 dimensions, 1 vote, 0 bullets. That is what genuine strategic sophistication looks like, and it is worth sitting with that assessment rather than racing past it to the comfort of the simpler story about China making a blunder. This does not mean China's position is morally unimpeachable. It is not. A world in which nuclear-armed rogue states can close international waterways without consequence because a veto prevents the international community from acting is not a stable or desirable world. The 11 nations that voted yes, Bahrain, Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia, Liberia, Panama, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the United Kingdom, and the United States, were not wrong that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz constitutes an unacceptable threat to the global economy. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization's warning about a potential global food crisis, the the 250 million barrels already drained from global emergency reserves, the $4.125 gasoline at American pumps, the fertilizer shortages threatening crop yields heading into 2027. These are real consequences with real human costs that China's veto, at minimum, did nothing to alleviate. But moral correctness and strategic effectiveness are distinct categories, and conflating them produces analytical error. China made a move that was strategically sophisticated and morally complex simultaneously. That is the nature of great power competition. It is almost always morally complex. And the intellectual failure of much Western analysis consists precisely in refusing to hold those two things in mind at the same time. What should you take from all of this, practically and concretely, as you think about navigating the world that this crisis is reshaping? The dollar's reserve dominance is eroding, slowly, unevenly, contested at every step, but eroding nonetheless. The dollar's share of global reserves, at 57%, is at its lowest in 25 years. The yuan, at 2.1% of global reserves, is not yet a credible replacement, and most serious analysts agree that a full transition to a petro-yuan is not imminent. The more likely near-term outcome is a multipolar currency system, dollar-denominated and yuan-denominated oil trade coexisting, with the dollar's structural advantages of deep capital markets, legal predictability, and network effects sustaining its primacy even as that primacy gradually contracts. But gradually is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, because the direction of travel matters as much as the current position. And the direction of travel has been set by a vote in a chamber in Manhattan on April 7, 2026, when the world's largest oil buyer raised its hand and voted against its own rescue, and thereby executed what may be the most consequential financial maneuver of this generation. The question every serious investor, every business leader, every household navigating rising prices at the pump and the grocery store should be asking is not the tactical one. Will Iran reopen the strait? Will the blockade hold? Will a deal get done? Those questions matter, and their answers will determine oil prices in the near term. The deeper question, the structural one, the one that will shape where money flows for the next decade, is whether the petrodollar system that has underwritten American financial supremacy since 1974 can survive a world in which America's military cannot reliably guarantee the security of the waterway through which that system flows. China just cast its vote on that question, and it did so without spending a single dollar on weapons. It spent only one vote. I want to hear your assessment in the comments. Do you believe the petrodollar survives this crisis intact, or are we watching the beginning of a genuine structural transition? Is China's calculation as brilliant as this analysis suggests, or are there dimensions of this that Beijing has miscalculated? The most serious conversation about the global economy happening anywhere right now belongs in the comments below this video. And remember, this is for education and discussion only, not personal financial advice. I'm sharing a way to think through the history, the market, and the ownership questions so you can make your own decisions with your own money and your own risk tolerance.